No. There. Yes, lock the doors. Am I doing lock the doors? Lock the doors! Order. The ayes to the right, 317. The noes to the left, 181. The ayes to the right, 317. The noes to the left, 181. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. The business of the House motion that the House has just agreed to provides for motions 3 to 9 on today's order paper to be debated together. But I can assure the House that the question will be put separately on each motion at the end of the debate. So we come first to motion number 3 on public health, and I call the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, to move the motion with which the House will also debate motions 4 to 9. Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that these regulations are approved. 2 weeks ago, I pledged to the House that for significant national measures, we will consult Parliament in advance of their coming into force wherever possible. And today we deliver on that commitment with votes tonight on national measures to slow the spread of coronavirus. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this pandemic remains a formidable threat. Our strategy is to suppress the virus, supporting the economy, education and the NHS until a vaccine makes us safe. And I must report to the House that the number of cases of coronavirus has quadrupled in the last 3 weeks. There are now more people in hospital with coronavirus than there were on the 23rd of March. And in the last 4 weeks, hospitals in the northwest and northeast of England have seen a 7-fold increase in the number of COVID patients in intensive care. In these worst affected areas, the virus is spreading just as quickly in older age groups, not just amongst younger adults. And of course, I'll give way.
Giving way, given that Liverpool City region, which includes my own constituency of Wallasey, has been placed in Tier 3 as of yesterday. Could the Secretary of State just outline if there are plans to reopen or revive the Nightingale hospitals to serve that region? And I don't mean the hospital in Manchester.
Well, yes, as she'll know, 3 Nightingale hospitals were put on alert yesterday to be reopened, and the Nightingale closest in question is in Manchester, but we keep this under review because expanding the capacity of the NHS is one of the things that we can do. But nevertheless, no matter how big the NHS were, if this virus is not under control, then the virus will make more people need hospital treatment than there could possibly be hospital treatment available for. So whilst, yes, of course, we're restarting the Nightingales, which have been mothballed for months, that is only a precaution. It can't be the full answer to the question. And we had a very good discussion yesterday about the measures in Liverpool City region, which I'll come on to in some detail. I'll give way one more time and then make a bit of progress.
Just following up what my right honourable friend said about, our strategy is to suppress the virus until a vaccine makes us safe, until science saves us. But of course there is a possibility, and the Prime Minister yesterday was very wisely cautious in his answer to our honourable friend from Wickham in his response around the vaccine. What if it doesn't come? And what if it comes and the efficacy of it is not good enough, and there are challenges with rollout and all sorts of other challenges that he and I know about, the anti-vaxxers notwithstanding? Can he give us, those of us who are nervous about these ideas?
Order. This is not a question. This is a very quick intervention. I have 89 people who want to speak. If there are to be interventions, they must be short. Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course the work on a vaccine continues. No vaccine technology is certain, but we have already bought 6 different vaccines, and there are over 100 in development around the world, and that is what underpins the strategy, and the work on the leading vaccines, including the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, continues effectively. We've seen both here and overseas just how quickly the virus can take hold, and we have to act now to get it under control. And yes, of course.
At the beginning of August, Calderdale had just 4 people in hospital with COVID, 0 in ICU, and spikes in just 2 wards. This morning, we've got 43 people in hospital with COVID, 6 in ICU, 12 deaths this month, and almost 800 positive cases coming through. Can my honourable friend say what steps he is taking to ensure that the NHS is not overwhelmed by the virus in the coming weeks?
I have just said that we mustn't have long interventions. These are the speeches that people are waiting to make later. If a member has an intervention to make on the Secretary of State on something he has just said, that is all very well. But making the points that members wish to make about their constituencies at this stage, rather than waiting later, is simply dishonourable. It's just not right. Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend, because he is an honourable man, it makes an important point that has wider context than just his constituency, which is that we must make sure that we control the virus. My heart goes out to the families of those in his constituency who have died, because the only alternative to suppressing the virus is that it then expands exponentially. That is what happens with a virus if the R is above 1. And I know that some people do feel that we should adopt a more relaxed approach, but I think it will lead to more of the sort of thing that my honourable friend has related from his constituency. Some people have set out, just 1 second, some people have set out this more relaxed approach, including in the so-called Great Barrington Declaration. And I want to take this argument head on, because on the substance, the Great Barrington Declaration is underpinned by 2 central claims, and both are emphatically false. First, it says that if enough people get COVID, we will reach herd immunity. This is not true. Many infectious diseases never reach herd immunity, like measles and malaria and AIDS and flu. And with increasing evidence of reinfection, We should have no confidence that we would ever reach herd immunity to COVID, even if everyone caught it. Herd immunity is a flawed goal without a vaccine, even if we could get to it, which we can't. The second central claim is that we can segregate the old and the vulnerable on our way to herd immunity. This is simply not possible. As the medical director of the NHS said yesterday, we cannot somehow fence off the elderly and the vulnerable from risk while everyone else returns to normal. It's neither conscionable nor practicable. Not when so many people live in intergenerational homes, when older people need carers who, of course, themselves live in the community, and not when young people can suffer the debilitating impact of long COVID. Whenever we've seen cases among young people rise sharply, we then see cases among the over 60s rise inevitably thereafter. And we are not the kind of country that abandons our vulnerable or just locks them up. If we let this virus continue unchecked, the loss of life would be simply too great to contemplate. And we know it would put our NHS at risk, as my honourable friends have just said. We know this both because of what happened in March and because of what is happening right now. We've already heard from the heads of the Academy of Royal Colleges and the Royal College of Emergency Medicine that if we don't act fast and come together to quash this virus, then we risk putting the NHS under extraordinary strain, both for COVID treatments and non-COVID treatments too. And of course, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
My right honourable friend, how long do the scientists think we will need these lockdowns for, and what's their exit plan?
Well, we have seen the exit plan from local lockdowns. For instance, in Leicester, where we had a firm local lockdown, the case rate came right down. We lifted that, and we have sadly seen it start to rise again. So it is determined by the amount of social mixing that the lockdown reduces. And so there is an argument that in some of the parts of the country where the case rate has continued to rise, there is an argument for further ensuring that you don't get the contact that is at the root of the virus spreading. And that is the challenge, is how to calibrate the lockdown to get the virus under control whilst doing the minimum damage to the economy and to education. And I'll give way to the honourable lady and then my right honourable friend.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Will he acknowledge, a simple yes or no, that we wouldn't be in this position in the first place, and actually the best exit strategy is by having an effective system of testing, tracing and isolating, which is locally led, and if that were working properly, even SAGE has admitted it isn't, we wouldn't be here.
We have one of the biggest systems of tracking and tracing in the world. And the idea that I sometimes get from people in this House that somehow it is not one of the biggest in the world or one of the most effective in the world, I get that in this House. We don't get it when I talk to my international colleagues. They ask the question, how did you manage to build this capacity so fast? And that is the truth of it. Of course we need to continue to build it. Of course we do. And of course we need to make sure it's continuously more integrated into the local communities who can often go and reach the contacts who the national system find it hard to reach. Of course we need to do that. But to argue that the enormous system that is working so effectively with so many brilliant people working on it, to argue that is at the root of this challenge is unfortunately to miss the big picture, which is sadly this virus passes on until we have a vaccine or a massive testing capacity that nobody yet has. This virus passes on through social contact, and that is what we need, unfortunately, to tackle in order to get this under control. And I just want to make this point on the numbers. In the first peak, around 8% of people caught COVID and 42,000 people died. If we don't have the virus under control, even with the better survival rates that we now have, thanks to both drug discoveries by British science and improvements in clinical practice, those figures will multiply. And in addition, then, harder economic measures would inevitably be needed to get it under control and needed for longer. And if you, like me, Madam Deputy Speaker, want our economy back on full throttle, then we need to keep this virus in check. I'll give way. Yes.
Full to the Secretary of State. Yesterday, in his call with Merseyside MPs, he was asked about a circuit breaker lockdown, and he did not say that SAGE had recommended this 3 weeks ago. So is that the case? And will he now publish the full scientific evidence for a circuit breaker lockdown?
Well, the SAGE advice that ministers receive is, of course, published. And we've had great debates in this House about that, and it is published. And then we make decisions that are guided by the science, taking into account all of the different considerations that we need to look to. Yes.
Right, honourable friend. Look, I think it's worth giving credit to the NHS Test and Trace team for the growth in testing, but the evidence published yesterday said that the impact of the testing and tracing system was only having a marginal effect on reducing the virus. So my argument to the Secretary of State is, can he look not just in high-risk areas, but in all areas, to get more of the contact tracing done by our fantastic directors of public health and their teams?
Yes, absolutely, and we are doing precisely that. And the way that it works, where it works best, is that the big national system makes the immediate and rapid contact with people who test positive, and for more than half of people that is immediately successful. And then when contacts are harder to make, they pass the data to the local team, who don't have the scale to do the immediate rapid contacting, but do have the boots on the ground and the local knowledge. And that combination of the two is what works best where it works well. I'll give away one more time and then make some progress, Madam Deputy Speaker.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend, who's making a very compelling case. But will he bear in mind that in the West Midlands we are concerned yesterday that the change that was made was on the basis of neatness and not on medical need? Will he reassure me that he will always listen carefully to the West Midlands Mayor, Andy Street, as these matters all develop?
Yes, yes. In the introduction of the three-level system does mean that in some areas where the local area has been working so effectively under the leadership of Andy Street in the West Midlands, to get the curve flattened, there has been a rise in the last few days of data, but it has essentially made a huge amount of progress. There have had to be changes made there, but I will absolutely recommit to working with Andy Street, who is an incredibly effective voice for the West Midlands, to make sure that what we can do together can best deliver to control the virus in the West Midlands. And I pay tribute to my right honourable friend who makes the case on this so effectively, because protecting our economy and protecting our health are not alternatives. We must act and keep the virus under control to protect lives and livelihoods. And here, Madam Deputy Speaker, I strongly believe that every single one of us, young or old, has the ability to help to suppress this virus through the actions that we take. And the best way to protect the vulnerable, to support the NHS, and to protect the economy is to get the rate of transmission down. Now, turning to the steps we're taking to do this, and therefore the instruments before the House today, yesterday the Prime Minister provided an update on the measures that we're taking, and this centres around 3 local COVID alert levels in England. Yes.
I'm very grateful. The incidence of the rate of transmission varies very significantly by within the 8 different districts of North Yorkshire. When we're looking at putting different areas within the different tiers, can we look at that by district rather than looking at a county level?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I'll go further than that. We look at it at sub-district level, if that's appropriate. In High Peak, we put 4 wards into level 2, and the rest of the wards stayed in level 1. So we're prepared to look at sub-district level if that's appropriate. And in the case of, for instance, some of the districts within North Yorkshire, they have individual outbreaks in individual institutions that we're managing. We shouldn't mistake that for general community transmission and therefore put them into a higher level than is necessary. And I'm very happy to go through the local epidemiology from near Thirsk that affects my honourable friend's constituency. And that, in a sense, brings us to the point of these local COVID alert levels. And these are the first SIs, Madam Deputy Speaker, that are being debated under the commitment that we made that significant national measures with effect in the whole of England or UK-wide with them, we will consult Parliament, and wherever possible, we'll hold votes before the regulations come into force, and that's what we're doing today. And Madam Deputy Speaker, local action has proved to be one of our most important lines of defence. Where firm action has been taken, for instance in Leicester or in Bolton, where we flattened the curve, our local approach has inevitably, though, produced different sets of rules in different parts of the country, as my right honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield was setting out. We've already moved towards simpler national rules centred on the rule of 6, and now we're acting to simplify and standardise the rules at a local level too. These regulations set out 3 levels of alert: medium, high and very high. The medium alert level, which will cover most of the country, will consist of the current national measures. This includes the rule of 6 and the closure of hospitality at 10 p.m. The high alert level reflects the interventions in many local areas at the moment. That aims to reduce household-to-household transmission by preventing social mixing between different households indoors with the rule of 6 outdoors. It's super simple. No household mixing socially indoors, the rule of 6 outdoors. And the very high alert level will apply where transmission rates are rising most rapidly and where the NHS will soon be under unbearable pressure without further restrictions. In these areas, the government will set a baseline of prohibiting social mixing whilst allowing households to mix in public outdoor spaces, and the reason for that is that's where the risk of transmission is lowest, so long as, of course, the rule of 6 is followed. This baseline is set out in the very high alert regulations being considered today. Pubs and bars will be closed, and we'll advise against travel into and out of very high risk areas. And we also offer a package of support for individuals, businesses and councils, and this includes more support for local test and trace, as many have asked for, more funding for local enforcement, and the offer of help from the armed services, and the job support scheme as announced by the Chancellor. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this is best done as a team effort, and we want to build local support on the ground before we introduce these measures wherever possible. So in each area, we'll work with local government leaders on the extra measures that need to be taken. We do not rule out further restrictions in the hospitality, leisure, entertainment or personal care sectors, but retail, schools and universities will remain open.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. In buying in the local community, I'd be grateful if he'd consider whether there be a government postcode checker so people know exactly where they should be in having the 3 tiers. Thank you.
Well, my honourable friend, the honourable gentleman, my friend, the honourable gentleman, says from a sedentary position that was his idea. Well, success has many fathers, because I can tell my honourable friend over here that such a postcode checker was launched this morning. And I'll send him the link. It's in beta still, so it's constantly going to be improved, not least to make sure that if postcode covers an area that's in 2 different levels, to make that clear, that needs is being sorted at the moment. But a postcode checker is a great idea. It tells you the local risk. And furthermore, the NHS COVID app, which has now been downloaded by over 17 million people, that has a link to your local alert level as well. Turning back to the measures before us, we'll keep these measures under constant review, and while the overarching regulations sunset after 6 months, paragraph 1 of Regulation 1105 makes clear that the allocation of a particular area to local alert level 3 will automatically expire after 28 days. We'll work with local areas on the level they need to be at, and this work continues at pace. Decisions to move local areas between the levels will be considered by the JBC, working across government and with local government on the normal weekly cycle. While of course there will be times when we need to act quickly to contain the virus, we want to give the opportunity for the House to consider the measures in the medium and high local alert levels and the baseline measures for the very high alert level, and I would urge the House to support the measures set out today.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He mentioned that they will work with local authorities when moving authorities between areas. Will he also give time for measures local authorities may already be taking, such as in Newcastle-under-Lyme, to see the effect of those before moving areas from one tier to another?
Yes, that's a very important point, and taking into account all local considerations and working with the local Director of Public Health and political leadership is important to get exactly that sort of consideration into the decisions. Madam Deputy Speaker, if you'll permit me, I'd like to set out, as the Prime Minister did yesterday, the details of where we've reached with the Liverpool City region. Liverpool will move on to level 3 tomorrow, and as well as the baseline measures, that is, as well as closing pubs and bars, gyms, leisure centres, betting shops, adult gaming centres and casinos will also close, and I'd like to thank all the local authorities who've been working with us to keep the virus under control, but there is more work to do. Madam Deputy Speaker, the regulations under consideration today also include measures on the obligations for businesses. Regulation 1005 makes it a legal requirement for a range of premises to collect, retain and, where relevant, disclose contact details as part of NHS Test and Trace. Regulation 1008 allows for fixed penalty notices to be given for breaches of COVID secure business guidance in various settings, primarily hospitality. These are amended by Regulation 1046, which adds the need for a range of premises to display information about the need to wear face coverings. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, Regulation 1029 increases the fines for those flouting targeted action to close specific public places that are a threat to public health. Although 1029 was intended to deliver the 10 p.m. closing time when laid, the elements relating to the 10 p.m. closing time are superseded by the local alert level system, and these powers in Regulation 1029 are therefore revoked. So in practice, the effect of Regulation 1029 is to deliver enforcement against individual places that have been flouting the rules, which is one of the top demands of councils in their fight against coronavirus. And I know that most people and most businesses have been doing their bit, and these changes are there to ensure that the vast majority of responsible businesses are not undermined by others who aren't following the rules. I'll happily give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State talks about a regulation that has been enforced for 4 weeks in terms of pubs closing at 10 o'clock. There may be some undoubted positives on health, but we see some negatives with people amassing together on public transport and the streets. Do the positives outweigh the negatives as far as the science is concerned?
Yes, I believe that they do. And I will give 3 reasons why I think that these measures are the right ones. The first is that we already now have evidence from accident and emergency departments that we've seen a reduction in alcohol-related admissions late at night after the 10 p.m. curfew. This is both important in its own right, but it's also a proxy as a measure of how much people are drinking late at night, and therefore is evidence that there is less mixing and less drinking late at night. The second is that whilst people may be coming out and mixing after 10 p.m, they are doing so largely outside, and they would otherwise be mixing inside the premises. It's just easier to photograph outside. The final point, though, and the appeal I'd make to the House on this is as follows. Since, in order to control this virus, we need to reduce the amount of social contact, sadly, that is necessary, and we're trying to protect as much as is possible education and protect as much as is possible work, essentially that leaves socialising as the other part of life, of activity, where people transmit the virus. And so it is therefore understandable that governments around the world and around this United Kingdom, governments of all different stripe, political persuasion, have all come to broadly the same conclusion, which is it is necessary to restrict socialising, because that way we reduce the transmission with the least damage to education and the economy. So whilst there is both direct and proximate evidence for the impact, the positive impact of this measure. There is also the strategic point, which is if we want to control the virus and we weren't to do this, we would have to do something else, and we want to, as a matter of policy choice, protect education and protect work. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I will now come to my concluding remarks, because we know only too well the damage that this lethal virus can inflict, the strain it can put on our NHS, and the way it can upend our closest relationships and our freedom to do the things we love. I know that we're asking a lot of the British people, but we also know that, together, we can shift this curve, and we now are called upon to do it once more. The measures before the House today will help in that fight, and I commend the regulations to the House.
The question is motion number 3, as on the order paper. And just before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, it will be obvious to the House, those in the chamber and those watching around the building, that I have more than 80 people who are trying to catch my eye, and that we have until 6 p.m. to conclude the debate. So I'm afraid that means starting right at the beginning in order to be fair to everybody, because I appreciate that this is not an occasion for long thought out speeches on matters of principle, but on matters to do with individual constituencies, and therefore to try to give as many people from as many parts of the country the chance to contribute. We will start with a time limit of 3 minutes. Jonathan Ashworth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I've heard your message loud and clear, and I will endeavour to be brief and not detain the House for too long, given the points that you've quite rightly made. The House will understand we are grappling with a virus that spreads with speed and severity, and throughout this crisis we have urged the government to adopt an approach with the strategic aim of suppressing the virus, bringing the R below 1 in order to save lives, minimise harm and keep our children in school. This has to be our priority, and no one should be surprised that with autumn and as we are in autumn and going into winter, that this would present us with immense challenges when dealing with the virus. Before the summer, the Academy of Medical Sciences, in a report commissioned by the government, modelled that we could see 119,000 deaths between September and June 21. The Academy also warned, as did we, that without an effective test, trace and isolation regime, the virus would get out of control. Sadly, we were proved correct. The Secretary of State has ran through the numbers on the virus, of the prevalence of the virus. But can I just underline the point that hospital admissions are rising? Yesterday, 3,665 patients in hospital in England. That is 568 more than on the 23rd of March when we went into lockdown. Since September, 856 patients have been admitted to critical care across England, Wales and Northern Ireland, more with every week that goes by. The largest number of critical admissions are in the North West, North East, Yorkshire and Midlands. Over 100 patients are on ventilation for COVID across the North East and Yorkshire. Over 130 patients are on ventilation across the North West. And a disproportionate number of those in critical care today are from poorer backgrounds and from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. It is a reminder that COVID thrives on and exaggerates inequalities, and that any long-term COVID strategy can't just rely on a vaccine, but demands an all-out assault on health inequalities as well. And just as hospital beds fill, there are more concerns about the availability of beds for the rest of winter. Last week, warnings that some hospitals across the north of England are set to run out of beds for COVID patients within days. NHS providers reminding us that the sustained physical and psychological and emotional pressure on health staff is threatening to push them beyond their limits. The BMA is saying that without stringent measures rapidly introduced, the NHS and its workforce will very quickly be overwhelmed. This House cannot understate how serious this situation is. So, yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, as the Secretary of State said, our clinicians have made extraordinary strides in treatment. We know steroids and antiviral drugs will help improve mortality. But we also know that when infections rise, that as night follows day, hospitalisations rise, and sadly and tragically, that means more will die as well. And for those who avoid hospitalisation, We know many of them can be afflicted with serious long-term debilitating health problems, so-called long COVID, and none of us know whether whether that syndrome will rest for the rest of our lives or whether they will recover in the next 12 months. But again, just as we have to protect our NHS, we cannot allow the mass industrial, never seen before in the history of the NHS, halt to elective surgery and delaying treatment. We have to mobilise our National Health Service to perform the care for non-COVID patients as well. Because that decision in March, though entirely understandable, I don't criticise the government for taking it, but that decision in March has bequeathed us waiting lists of 4 million, and today there are 111,000 people waiting beyond 12 months for treatment. In January of this year, it was just 1,600. 3 million people have missed out on vital cancer screening. 1 in 3 cancer patients have said their treatment has been impacted by the effects of COVID. I make these points not to criticise the Secretary of State, but to reinforce the point that we have to protect our National Health Service as we go into the winter months. And I know that no member across this House is complacent about these matters. Every honourable and right honourable member is united and determined to see infection rates reduced and care improved. I know everyone across this House wants to see this immense backlog in non-COVID care tackled. I know none of us want to see this virus rip and leave the weakest and frail to fend for themselves. So I do not come to this House to caricature the position of any honourable member. Our differences are about how we apply the tools we have at our disposal and how we confront this, the biggest public health crisis for 100 years. Now we know, as the Secretary of State said, that the virus thrives on close human contact, especially where air is stagnant and in conditions that are poorly ventilated. We know the virus is airborne. We know that fundamentally our best defences are hand hygiene, distancing, mask wearing, avoiding crowds. But we also know that a full national lockdown, stretching for weeks and weeks and weeks, like we had through April, with a rule effectively of one household, a rule of one, indeed, for some people, would be disastrous for society. But again, I don't believe anyone in the House is proposing that. The question is, what measures can be taken now to bring R below 1 without resorting to that full lockdown? We know that when 8 million children return to school, that would have put upward pressure on infection rates. I'm critical of the government for not providing the extra testing capacity that would have been needed and should have been obvious. But we must do everything we can to keep our children in school. The implications of children not being in school are devastating to their life chances and development. We know that crowded public transport puts upward pressure on infection rates, but I don't believe any member of this House would consider it sensible to close public transport networks, to close the Underground or to close the Metrolink across Manchester. We know we have to encourage people to work from home, and many are doing that, but we also know there are many who can't work from home, and they should be protected with access to mass testing, of course, particularly NHS staff, and I hope the government get on with routine testing of frontline NHS staff. We've repeatedly called the government to do that. But that then, therefore, leaves us with few levers to pull, which brings me to hospitality. Because, and I'm sorry to say it, but pubs and bars do bring people together. Every member across this House knows that after a few drinks, people lose their inhibitions. It should come as no surprise to us that social distancing breaks down, and if bars and pubs are poorly ventilated, as sadly some are, the airborne transmission is more of a risk. And I know members will point out to me, as they have done in the last few days, that the data shows household interaction is the biggest driver of transmission. And that is correct. But how does the virus get into the household in the first place? It doesn't come down the chimney like Father Christmas, Madam Deputy Speaker. Someone brings it into the house. But if we cannot close schools, if we cannot close workplaces, if we cannot close shops, if we cannot shut down public transport, then the only lever we have is hospitality. So yes, we support the restrictions that have been announced yesterday by the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister, and we know from the experience of Bolton and Leicester that pub closures did have an impact. The virus is still prevalent in my city and in Bolton, but without those pub closures, the virus would have been driven up further. So we support the measures that have been announced, as difficult as they are, Madam Deputy Speaker. And indeed, we support the measures aimed at containing the amount of time that people can spend in the pub. I understand the procedural points that the Secretary of State has made about the instruments before us with respect to the 10 p.m. curfew. And he knows, as I know, that there are many members deeply sceptical across the House about the 10 p.m. curfew. We won't stand in the way of the passage of that statutory instrument. But can I say to the Secretary of State, if the procedures of the House would have allowed it, we would have brought forward an amendment to that part of the instrument to implement the Welsh scenario, where, as I understand it, there is drinking up time, there is off sales are banned after 10 o'clock, and you don't have the hard stop at 10 p.m, because we've all seen the pictures, as the honourable member from Bexhill, yes? Yeah, Bexhill and Battle pointed out. Although I do have to say to my honourable friends, who many of whom make this point about city centres filled with revellers coming out of the pub, you know, it's not as if we saw these pictures only once this 10 p.m. curfew was introduced. We have seen these pictures before in our city centres, sadly. I mean, I have been on public transport after 11 o'clock at night in city centres and seen people. So this is a long-standing issue. The 10 p.m. curfew does not help it, but let's not pretend it has caused all these issues. I'll give way, but I don't want to give way often because of the timing.
Amend it. Will he also amend it so that off-licences can't sell after 10 p.m?
Yes, I think I made that point, but yes, I most certainly would. And if I'd put forward that amendment, I hope the honourable gentleman would have gone through the division lobbies with us. I know since he left the government, he's very relaxed about going through the division lobbies with the opposition. Excuse me, I drank my water too quickly because your intervention was shorter than I was anticipating. Listening to Madam Deputy Speaker's fault. So I beg your pardon. It's not the virus. I can assure members. Anyway, but I also have to say to the Secretary of State, and I'm sure many members affected by this in recent days will know that the decisions made to put an area into restrictions will only be effective if made in conjunction with local people. I know this extremely well as a Leicester member, where we have had restrictions in Leicester now for 105 days or 106 days. I believe it is. So people in towns like Bury or Bolton, or across Greater Manchester, or boroughs like Wolverhampton or West Bromwich, or parts of Birmingham, as the honourable gentleman, the former Cabinet Minister, said earlier, people living there need clarity about their future, and local leaders need reassurance that there is a plan. Local leaders need reassurance that if they're put into a particular tier, there is a plan to get them out of that tier and moved into the lower tiers. And also, it is not clear at the moment why particular areas are in the medium tier and not in tier 2, for example. I don't want to pick on my near parliamentary neighbour from Charnwood, but I hope he can answer when he responds to debate. Why is it that the City of Leicester is in tier 2 with the restrictions, but his constituency of Charnwood, where currently infection rates are 150 per 100,000, isn't? Why is it that North East Derbyshire, where infection rates are 164 per 100,000, are not in that tier? Why is it Barrow, where the infection rates are 277 per 100,000, are not in that tier? There are lots of other examples across the House. I think people living in areas where restrictions are in place would like to be reassured that there is some consistency on these matters and that decisions are made in a transparent way. I don't want to pick on his area, but I think you can see the point I am trying to make. But of course, those areas where hospitality has closed, they need support to save jobs and protect livelihoods. Because at the moment, there is a financial package on offer for Tier 3. This side of the House does not think it goes far enough. We do not think it is adequate. But there is no financial support for Tier 2, even though there will be a significant impact on the local economy, as we have seen in Leicester. Finally, on Tiers 2 and 3, could the Minister, in responding to debate later, say a little bit about care homes? Because what does he say to the thousands of families who under Tier 2 and now in Tier 3 will not be able to visit their loved ones in care homes? The impact of a loved one in a care home not being able to see their family is immense, especially in the winter months as we run up to Christmas. So what steps will the government take to support those areas in Tiers 2 and 3 so families can safely resume visiting their loved ones? And will he commit to a 24-hour turnaround in test results in care homes so that care homes residents are protected? And this brings me to testing and tracing. One of the great strides we made in Leicester with door-to-door testing. Can the Minister guarantee that any area in Tier 2 and Tier 3 will get capacity for door-to-door testing? And back in August, the government promised that local areas would have more control over test and trace, with dedicated teams backed up by local authorities. But under this tiered system, it was reported yesterday that only areas in Tier 3 would have greater local control over contact tracing and testing. But why isn't this put in place months ago? And why isn't it put in place everywhere across the country, not just for Tier 3? Because this is the point that the honourable member from the Forest of Dean made, and he made it extremely well. If the testing and trace regime, I'm sorry, has become a broken system that continues to misfire. And we even have SAGE now warning that it is having a marginal impact on transmission, as the right honourable gentleman said. To be frank, and I know opposition members groan at this, but to be frank, if Serco haven't come up with a solution by now, they never will. Scrap the contract, put public health and local NHS partnerships in control of testing, and invest in the widespread backward contact tracing we need. It's still only in its infancy. It's absolutely vital to getting in control of the virus. We need expanding it at a local level. I will, but I'm conscious of time. But
I thank him for giving way. Will he agree with me that one of the other reasons why SAGE said that test and trace and isolate is having a marginal impact is because the isolate part isn't working? And does he agree with me that rather than slapping £10,000 fines on people for not self-isolating, what we actually need to do is provide incentives and support so that people isolate?
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right. I agree entirely with her. I have been having these exchanges with the Secretary of State now since, almost on a twice-weekly basis. And when I go over and I remind myself of the remarks that I've made at the dispatch box, to remind myself of what he said at the dispatch box in case I can catch him out and all that kind of stuff and throw quotes back at him, I've noticed that we were making this argument months and months and months ago. And it's not good enough just to give one £500 payment. People need support to isolate, because if you're poor on a 0 hours contract, or if you're forced with making a choice between feeding your family or going to work, you'll go to work. And it's been one of the most significant failures in the test, trace and isolate regime, and the government, I'm afraid to say, still haven't fixed it. So we would argue again that they have to put testing and tracing in the hands of public health and local NHS partnerships, because unless we get testing sorted out, we will have a never-ending rollercoaster of restrictions while deaths and damage continue. And when it comes to the overall set of restrictions announced yesterday, the fundamental question for us as an opposition, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not whether they go too far, but whether the overall package, in fact, goes far enough. It was a question posed by the Chief Medical Officer himself at the Downing Street press conference yesterday, who commented that the areas worst hit by COVID will need extra measures on top of those announced on Monday if infection rates are to be significantly lowered. So the question is, will the measures announced yesterday reverse the riding tide of hospital admissions? Will they reverse the riding tide of critical care admissions? I obviously hope so, but I'm sorry, I fear not. And the rate of growth in the virus may at this stage be quicker in the northern regions, but the embers are burning brightly everywhere else as well. And I fear further action is going to be needed. Now, the Prime Minister says he follows the science. Yesterday, the SAGE minutes that came out after the press conference, frustratingly, warned of a very large epidemic with catastrophic consequences, and that the burden of a large second wave would fall disproportionately on the frailest in society, but also those on lower incomes and Black, Asian and minority ethnic community. And that last point is exactly what is currently happening in our ICU units across the country. And the same minutes revealed that the government was also advised to close all hospitality, move all university teaching online, and put in place a national circuit break 3 weeks ago with immediate action. The government rejected that advice, presumably in favour of the measures we are debating today. And of course, it's only advice to government. Ministers are perfectly within their rights to choose what advice to take and what advice not to take. To govern is indeed to choose, but the Prime Minister and indeed the Secretary of State have come to this dispatch box week after week and told us they are following the science. So at what precise moment did the Prime Minister stop following the science? And indeed, I'm sorry to say, SAGE advised the government to take action in March, but the Prime Minister was too slow. Now, after the Prime Minister spoke, we see yet again he has been advised to take action and has so far refused. But it's the same virus, the same delays, the same country and the same government making the same mistakes again. Our constituents will ask, is history repeating itself? Because if these tiers don't work, then what? Tier 4? Tier 5? What's the plan? Well, there isn't one, Madam Deputy Speaker. We had whack-a-mole, a fairground game, but it was never a strategy. It was just a soundbite from the circus ring showman. We've had exaggerated claims, complaints when challenged, a lack of transparency with the public, but now further action and a clear plan is needed. And it's just at the time when hospital admissions are rising again, we have the Prime Minister, like the scene in Withnail and I, hanging on to a rising balloon and doesn't know whether to let go before it's too late or hang on and keep letting it get higher. We have the highest deaths in Europe, the worst recession in Europe, and now not even pretending to follow the science. We will not divide the House against these restrictions because we believe, as far as they go, they are necessary. But I fear the government now need to go further. The sooner the Prime Minister is clear with the British public, the better.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I support these restrictions with a heavy heart. On balance, I will be supporting the government this evening, but just a few quick points. I would be very careful about subscribing to the Valence-Witty orthodoxy that inform these regulations, whilst not at all examining very carefully respectable bodies of medical opinion to the contrary. And I would cite particularly the Hennigan-Sikora-Gupta line. I think it's important that the Secretary of State and his ministerial team address those things head on and treat them with the respect that they deserve. Now, the Secretary of State has my utmost sympathy. When coming into office, he opened a box marked public health and found tools for doing all sorts of things like sorting out lifestyle problems, obesity, smoking, diet, all of that. He found very few, I suspect, that were geared towards dealing with infectious diseases, particularly this infectious disease. And he's done some good things, I have to say, to try to remedy that in a very short space of time. Can I suggest to him to sort out the honourable gentleman, the member for Leicester South's obsession with Serco, that he looks again at the Public Health Laboratories Service that was in its second incarnation, the Health Protection Agency, abolished in 2012, and he might find in such a thing the means to deal with infectious diseases of this sort in the future. We need to be careful about groupthink and confirmation bias and a thin evidential basis and uncertainty masquerading as certainty. There is a huge margin of uncertainty with all of this, and we all need to develop a level of humility when developing our attitudes towards dealing with this crisis, and that's why I should be supporting the government this evening. Yes, I will very quickly.
If you see, but I can't let the honourable gentleman get away with that. There were 2016, Operation Cygnus was very clear about what needed to happen. It wasn't a question of if there was going to be a pandemic, it was when. And the government failed to introduce all the recommendations from that. I will not let them get away with this.
Well, the honourable lady can do what she likes. The Secretary of State is dealing with the situation that he found at the time. And I have to say, developing the National Institute for Health Protection in short order from the disaster that was Public Health England, I think was a very good effort. But there's much, much more to be done, as the Secretary of State, I know, appreciates. Can I sound this cautionary note for the Secretary of State? And that is that we have gone to great measures to close down schools, and I appreciate the need for that, and that was informed, of course, by the Imperial College model that was a flu model in essence, and one that was inadequate for this particular virus. He will know, I hope he knows, of the work published last September by the Edinburgh group under Ackland, which suggests that that certainly did suppress admissions to ITU. It certainly protected the NHS, but probably over time, unless we get a vaccine, will cause more deaths directly from COVID, quite apart from the incidentals for other diseases, the loss of liberty and livelihood. He needs to understand that, and that there is an alternative view on that. If we don't get a vaccine, I fear that paradoxically we'll see more deaths, not fewer, as a result of some of the interventions that we have put in place. And of course, Ackland was unsighted on this latest set, but the logic would suggest that those measures too may, over time, if we get a third and fourth wave, cause more trouble than they solve. And it's a respectable piece of work, and he needs to take account of that. In all of this, we simply do not know, and we're learning all the time. And we have to accept, I think, that we have experts for a reason, and the expertise of those advising ministers. But there is an alternative view in this. And unless we get a vaccine, goodness me, I hope we do, I think we may find that the cure is worse than the disease in terms of lives lost directly to COVID, incidental lives lost to other common diseases, stroke, heart attack, and particularly cancer, loss of liberty, loss of livelihood, and our economy completely trashed. That's what's at stake. I don't envy the Secretary of State in his work.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, it does appear that anybody who questions or expresses doubts about the government's approach to the coronavirus is accused of wanting to let the virus rip. That is patently untrue. I support a number of the rules that have already been introduced. It's all about what the balance is and what is common sense, and whether it's going too far the other way, and also the impact upon civil liberties, and actually what will work and have a significant impact on trying to control it. And that's where the debate is, and about why some of us are raising questions about it. Now, these SIs today come on top of as many as 4 previous announcements between the 14th of September and the 3rd of October on additional national or local restrictions. The last was being a few days ago on the 3rd of October. Now, and there lies part of the problem, another raft of rules in these SIs today, when the public are bewildered and confused about the previous changes. This has resulted in many people not listening anymore, and they just want to use their common sense and get on with their lives. They want more clarity. And of course, there is a minority who do not follow the rules, but why should everybody else be penalised and their civil liberties be affected as well? Of course, we want more enforcement of the sensible common sense rules, and we need resources to be able to do that locally. And in addition, of course, to hand washing, social distancing and face masks, which I'll return to shortly. I've spoken to the chief executives of both my local hospitals, and they tell me they are under increasing pressure and there's a spike in admissions over the normal expected. But they also tell me that the majority who've been admitted are over 70s. And that's not different than the start of the pandemic. There should have been no surprise to the government. Part 2 of the SI sets out stricter, more restrictions on business, and I'm contacted every day by businesses who are in trouble and constituents who are worried about losing their jobs. 2,000 more people unemployed in Halton in my constituency since March. Nobody understands the reasoning behind a 10 p.m. curfew for hospitality. I've been inundated by constituents about the closure of gyms. Many of my constituents tell me how much has been done to make them safer and the impact it will have on their physical and mental health if they close. They want to see worthy evidence and reasonings for doing that. We do not hear enough from the government on the unintended consequences of restrictions on healthcare and the impact on diseases such as cancer and heart disease. Many of my constituents do not vote the measures that have been put forward of putting Hull into Tier 3, and I share their scepticism and concern. I have not seen the evidence to give my support to them. We seem to be used as a guinea pig. We need to better protect our elderly and vulnerable. We need better to enforce the rules that are sensible and common sense. We need to sort out the test and trace and isolate. It's not having the impact it should have done. We need lesser competence from this government, better data to be shared with both the public and MPs. The point remains, this government has got many things wrong, and it continues to do so. I have no trust in this government and the way it's working. And what we need to do is ensure that we get some competent and some proper reasoning behind the decisions.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to focus my remarks on whether there is currently any viable alternative to the lockdown measures that have been put in place in my constituency, including Nantwich. In my view, there is not. The argument put forward by some is that we could somehow isolate or protect the vulnerable to allow the rest of us to carry on with our lives as normal. But how realistic is that? I think we have to be clear about the numbers of people that we're talking about. This is not just about people in their 80s. Our current understanding is that approximately 1 in every 200 people in their 50s and 60s affected by coronavirus will die. For people in their 70s and up, that figure is more like 1 in 10. Taken together, those age groups add up to something like 25 million people. How viable is it that we can keep them safe? And what we must not do in answering that question is compare it to how successfully we've been able to do that so far. Because if we abandon lockdown measures for everyone else, there'll be one key difference. Right now, as we're all involved in the national effort to stop the spread of the virus, we all play a part in keeping the levels of the virus low. That means when a grandparent meets up with their grandchildren probably don't have the virus. It means when a plumber turns up to fix a pensioner's boiler, they probably don't have the virus. It means when a carer arrives to help get an infirm person out of bed, they probably don't have the virus. And most importantly, when an older person managing their chronic illnesses turns up to the next GP appointment or hospital appointment, the receptionists, the nurses, the doctors, the people in the waiting room probably don't have the virus. That's because we're all playing our part in trying to stop the spread. If we were to let the virus spread amongst the rest of the population, you can forget all of that. We'd reach a point where in every single one of those examples, the vulnerable person would stand a very real chance of catching the virus because it would be rampant. The reality is, that is the reality of the strategy some are proposing. We'd be effectively telling 25 million people to play Russian roulette every time they step outside their door. They can hug their grandchildren, but they run a real risk of catching a deadly disease if they do that. They can go to work, but they run a very real risk of catching a deadly disease if they do that. And most importantly, if they go to their cancer screening, their radiotherapy, their chemotherapy, again, they would run a very real risk of catching a deadly disease. That is no choice at all. But we do have a choice, and that is to persevere. It's not easy, and I have no doubt that we're paying a terrible price in terms of the economy, our well-being and our health. But I simply cannot see how that price will be outweighed by the loss of life on the scale we would see and the restrictions we would have to put in place on 25 million people if we were to give up. I just don't think we can justify abandoning the older members of our society to their fate. Not when, if we buy them more time, I believe we will find other ways forward. Whether it's a vaccine or mass daily testing, I think science will provide us with the solutions. I could be wrong, we could lose that battle in the long run, but we haven't lost it yet, and I don't think the British people are ready to surrender. I know I'm not. We must push on with these measures.
Maria, you go.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The coronavirus situation on Merseyside is such that I accept that something serious needs to be done. Yesterday in Aintree and the Royal Hospitals, 279 coronavirus positive patients, the highest number in any English hospital. Substantial and widespread community transmission, 600 cases per 100,000, and not just in student areas. A high incidence, and this is the worrying thing, of spread to vulnerable groups, particularly people over 65 years old, 31 in critical care. So something definitely needs to be done. But I do worry that the way in which the government has handled the pandemic so far and its manifestations and what impact this has had on the current situation in the northwest isn't helping. There's widespread feeling that lockdown in the Liverpool City region was lifted before cases had fallen far enough. The failings and increasingly poor performance of the nationally arranged test and trace system are making controlling the virus much harder. People are waiting many days to get results. Very many contacts of those testing positive are going untraced until it's too late for isolation to make a big difference. The lack of discussion, candour, until recently even engagement with local leaders, mayors and MPs means that there is a trust issue which was worsened by yesterday's events, at which the CMO suggested that these Tier 3 measures, which the Prime Minister had told the House would stop the epidemic growing, he said he had a high